Hi, I'm Ryan Szymanski, curator for Battleship New Jersey Museum and Memorial. And today, we've got another video on wood decks. But don't worry, it's mostly not about our deck or teak wood decks. See, we've put out so many videos about teak wood decks, and the Iowa-class battleships and most of the other preserved battleships so famously have teak wood decks that people assume that all warships use teak wood decks, and that simply isn't true. But 7 of the 8 preserved battleships have teak decks. North Carolina, Massachusetts, Alabama, and then of course the 4 Iowas, Iowa, New Jersey, Missouri, and Wisconsin. They all quite famously have 2-inch thick teak decks. Now, teak is a good choice for a number of reasons. It's an oily tropical hardwood, which means that it's very rot resistant. This stuff can last 20 years in service, probably 40 years sitting around without all the wear and tear of people walking on it. It provides traction, much better than steel. It provides a chafing surface for the stuff that's rolling over it, and most importantly, it provides insulation over the steel deck below it and the berthing spaces under that. So a lot of good reasons to have a wood deck, and a lot of reasons why teak is chosen. However, teak was not the first choice of wood for American battleships. And I'm not sure if any American battleships prior to the fast battleships of World War II, the North Carolina, South Dakota, and Iowa class, used teak, because teak does have some drawbacks. It's expensive, it's rough on tools, it's an oily hardwood, it's a dirty wood, which means if you get caught by a splinter of it, it's likely to get infected. And most importantly, it doesn't grow in the United States. It grows in what was that time Burma, which was a colony of Great Britain, nowadays known as Myanmar. So it has to be imported, we have to pay this other colonial power to get it, so it was not the ideal chosen wood. The cruiser Olympia was originally built with pine decks. I believe it's white pine. She is Great White Fleet era, and I don't know what the decks of all those battleships are, but it's a safe assumption that they are also using some sort of pine. It's also a safe assumption that it's not monolithic. If you look at sailing ships like Constellation or Constitution that have been preserved, other sailing ships around the world, you'll see that different types of wood are used in different parts of the ship. For example, oak is used for the exterior planking that is relatively resistant to being hit by shot, but you'll see things like pine being used for the decks and fir being used for the masts because it's a tall, straight tree and because it's relatively light. Obviously, you want less weight the higher up you go, whereas oak is pretty heavy and it tends to grow in these great angles, which make it great for creating frames and things that are curved. And so you see, much like the battleship is a mix of dissimilar metals, old sailing ships are a mix of dissimilar materials as well. Another battleship that we have an excellent example of is USS Texas. She is the only one of the preserved battleships that does not have a teak wood deck by design. As built, she used long leaf yellow pine, which once grew pretty extensively in the South and is significantly rarer and harder to find and harder to buy nowadays. It is an extremely fire-resistant wood, and it's it's fairly hard for pines and fairly rot-resistant for pines, and it, again, grows in these nice long strakes, so it's real easy to get long boards out of. However, while the majority of Texas's deck is pine, she still had areas where there was teak or other places on the ship where there were mahogany and other fancy hardwoods, much like Olympia has some other fancy woods on board as well. So again, a mixture of materials. Likewise, while it's a safe assumption, since Olympia uses a pine deck, Texas uses a pine deck, that all of the pre-dreadnought and dreadnought type battleships in there are using pine as well, different ships of the same class may well use different types of wood decks. For example, it was far more common for Japanese warships to use Taiwanese cypress as their wood decks. The aircraft carrier Kagi pretty famously uses a cypress deck. Likewise, the battleship Nagato built at Kure uses Taiwanese cypress, and that seems to be the main type of wood that Japanese warships used, except her sister ship Mutsu, built at the same time except at Yokosuka, used teak wood. So that teak would have been imported from Burma and was likely just what that shipyard had on stock. And so it's not monolithic from year to year or even from ship to ship built at the same time. Likewise, you see wartime shortages impacting both what ships are repaired with and what they're initially built with, or converted with in this case. When Chitose and Chiyoda are converted to aircraft carriers, there was not enough cypress around. The Japanese had limited shipping, and it's being sunk by American submarines, so getting stuff from Taiwan or Burma or anywhere else is difficult. Do you really want to be importing wood when you have other materials, when you've got to be bringing in oil and moving troops around and doing all these sorts of things, supplying your island garrisons? They're rebuilt with flight decks that are a mix of concrete, latex, and sawdust. So an interesting composite. Likewise, when the battleships Issei and Hyuga are converted into aircraft carriers, they get a straight concrete flight deck poured over them. They weren't expecting to have planes land on board, just launching, and so they didn't need the composite material. The Japanese are doing the quickest, cheapest conversions they can because it's wartime and materials are needed elsewhere. Shortages may have also impacted what wood deck was on American aircraft carriers. American aircraft carriers were not originally built with teak decks, especially the wartime built carriers. They used fir, I believe Douglas fir. It is relatively soft, it is real easy on tools, it's real easy to maintain. It'll even give some for when planes are slamming down into it. And most importantly, unlike teak, it's not as likely to infect you, give you an infection if it turns into shrapnel when a bomb punches through it, but real easy to repair. So there's a number of instances where American carriers are badly damaged, and they're able to basically replace the fir decks relatively quickly and resume flight operations. Both major damage like Yorktown receiving between at Coral Sea and repairing by Midway, and other ships that are like Enterprise in the Eastern Solomons, they're able to locally repair her and resume operations pretty quickly. However, as the Essex-class carriers, originally built with fir, are getting new flight decks and they're taking newer, heavier aircraft, they're getting teak wood put on their decks, they're getting steel patches in places over the decks that can absorb this. And nowadays, ships don't have wood decks at all. They have steel decks with non-skid painted over it, which is what gives you the traction. And they have fiberglass insulation on the inside of the ship, which is what provides that insulatory factor. So, all this being the case, why is this switch happening? Because on the pine ships, like Battleship Texas, the decks are 4 inches thick. For the treaty-limited ships, like the tin-clad cruisers and the treaty battleships, the fast battleships that the United States built, they wanted to save weight every way they could. And one way they could do that was by using a harder wood, teak. And they didn't mind that they were gold plating it by buying the more expensive foreign wood to do that. So rather than using the 4-inch thick pine like Texas and earlier battleships presumably all used, or mostly used, the fast battleships, the war-built cruisers, are going with this teak because for half the thickness, half the weight, it's providing pretty similar properties. And so it's entirely appropriate for a museum ship like Texas to redeck with pine as opposed to teak. And I believe they're using a different type than longleaf southern pine or yellow pine because that is pretty rare nowadays because it was so widely used in shipbuilding and other things. So the next best thing would be another type of pine as opposed to anachronistically using a teak. Alternatively, there's an argument to be made for things like plastique or other plastic type woods, trexes and other things like that are going to last arguably longer. There is an argument to be made that, hey, Texas had to redeck in the late 80s, early 90s, and here she is redecking again. If there is a product out there that maybe isn't completely accurate, but they can afford to do and they only have to do once, then there's certainly an argument to be made for that. But as a purist, I prefer to use what was originally there or the next closest thing if that isn't available. So did you know that all these different types of woods were used in warship constructions, that all warship decks are not teak? Let us know in the comment section down below. And remember that both Battleship New Jersey and Texas, and certainly most of the other museum ships that have wood fittings, sell some of that in their online store. So we got a link down to Texas's online store in the description here. They've got a lot of made products from their deck as they've been replacing it. And likewise, we've got the similar stuff from Battleship New Jersey's store, which now ships worldwide. Battleship New Jersey receives operating support from the New Jersey Department of State, also from a number of other businesses and private individuals like yourselves. We really appreciate your support. There's a link in the description below if you'd like to donate to support the museum. You can also support us by liking, sharing, and subscribing so more people find about the channel. Thanks for watching.